This program is made possible in part by a grant from Humanities Texas, the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
This has been an interesting series. We've been finding out a lot of neat things about some of our local missions, but what a lot of people don't realize is that the mission system itself was quite a large area. It, of course, started in Mexico when they first started the colonization in the 1530s. There had been missions there was a mission in Florida, in St. Augustine, which is still the oldest continuously occupied city in the United States. You had missions originally, the one for this area being Our Lady of Guadalupe, and even though it's got the beautiful cathedral now, it still has its original building dating from the middle 1600s. So that's the only still original mission in this area still standing. Then they did what El Paso is known for. They kept passing through, and they formed missions in New Mexico. But after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, some of the natives came south with the Spanish, which is why today there is an Isleta spelled with an I just outside of Albuquerque in New Mexico. There's an Isleta spelled with a Y here in Texas. There's a Socorro, New Mexico, and a Socorro, Texas. And those missions were founded in 1680, but the buildings, unfortunately, due to fire and floods and moving, haven't survived. The buildings that survive to this day either date from the 1860s or, in Isleta's case, 1907. There was a connection, though, between those missions and the rest of the system, because eventually you had missions that were being founded in eastern Texas, California, and Arizona. And I'm very pleased to present to you today Mr. Robert Vint. He is a restoration architect, and an architect. He does all sorts of things. So what I'm going to do is have him tell you his background, and the talk today is going to show you how all these mission systems blended together and who the different movers and shakers were that really got it started. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Susan Taylor. I am the Senior Education Curator here at the museum. I'm responsible for programs like this, school programs, summer camps, and belly dancing and Tai Chi and things like that there. So thank you all for coming, and let's welcome Mr. Robert Vint.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm not sure whether I should try to use the microphone or just use my natural speaking voice. Jane, what do you think? Can you hear me all right? Can everyone hear me without the microphone? Good, because I'd prefer not to use the microphone, because it always is a little uncomfortable. All right. Thank you, Sue, for inviting me and for organizing this. And in particular, I will talk about the mission system broadly, but in particular, more specifically about that in Sonora and Arizona as a representative example of how the Spanish attempted to transplant their culture, their religion, their way of doing things to the New World. Because when they arrived in what is now the borderlands of Mexico and the United States, we would include Sonora, Arizona, Chihuahua, New Mexico, Texas, Tamaulipas. It was a wild, untamed land. It was the edge of the known world. It was the edge of the Spanish Empire, and it was known as the rim of Christendom. And I take that title from Herbert Bolton, an historian at the University of California, who has written a book of that title, The Rim of Christendom, about Father Eusebio Francisco Kino, who was the founder of our mission in Tucson, Arizona. Now, this is the landscape south of Tucson, and it's a rather foreboding natural environment, as you can see. It's a very dry area where only cacti really thrive. And this is the land through which Kino came riding horseback in the late 1600s. This is our mission, known locally as the White Dove of the Desert, for clear reasons, because of its coating with lime whitewash to protect the old soft brick underneath. It was founded by Father Kino in 1691. So the Spanish missionaries really got to Arizona 100 years after they came through here. I think partly because of the harshness of the climate. You do have a river here, after all, and also the aggressiveness of our native tribes, the Apache were not especially welcoming to the Spanish. And in fact, the Spanish never settled further north than Tucson in Arizona, whereas in New Mexico, they had already made it all the way up to Santa Fe by 1609 because they met the more sedentary, settled Pueblo Indians who had urban architecture and had agriculture and were a more advanced society. In Arizona, the Apaches were raiders, hunters, gatherers. We had the Tohono O'odham, the desert people, who were living here when Kino arrived. And they were not so advanced. They were basically living a Stone Age existence. They had not developed ceramics. They wove baskets. They moved seasonally from the foothills of the mountains down to the riverbank, winter and summer. They practiced floodplain irrigation. When the river flooded, their plants would grow, and it didn't. They'd have to go catch a rabbit or who knows, anything else they could catch, a snake, a deer. I was with one of the Tohono O'odham. I've worked with them on some of their building plans, and I was working on the design of the Elder Center with a woman, Colleen Stone, of the tribe. And we were standing by the site, and it was one of the years when there were lots of cicadas. The cicadas were just putting up a racket, and we could hardly carry on a conversation. The cicadas were so loud. And then Colleen reached over to the leaves of a Palo Verde tree, and she pulled out a cicada, and she goes, "You know, there's meat here." And she popped it open. And she was raised by her grandmother in a dirt-floored hut made of mud and branches, and raised very, very traditionally, living essentially as the O'odham had done for hundreds and hundreds of years. And yet here we were in that was in the 1990s, that was the 20th century. What astonishes me about the native people of America is they had these traditional ways of life, and suddenly they encountered a more advanced European civilization in the form of the Spanish. You know, they came with armor, they came with armaments, and the native peoples really had very little with which to fight back other than their tenacity, of which they had generous amounts. Much of the information that I will convey to you here in regard to the work of Father Kino, I have gleaned from this little book, The Padre on Horseback, and it is essentially a sketch of the life of Kino. For the full version, for the full biography, you'd need to read The Rim of Christendom by the same author, Herbert Eugene Bolton, a very, very important Western historian. He lived up until the late 1950s. He was at Berkeley, I think, for 35 years and did lots of original scholarship on the importance of the Spanish presence in the U.S., what is now the U.S. Because prior to Bolton, most of the historians and most of the history in this country was focused on the Northeast, on the Dutch, on the English, on the French, and all of that was considered American history. And then Bolton, who was educated at Wisconsin, came out west, was fascinated, fell in love with it, and began researching and bringing to the wider attention all these interesting figures, like Kino, who was a major explorer, cartographer, as well as a missionary priest. And he was indeed the Padre on horseback. He explored all these desert lands on horseback. And I'll read a short passage from the book, The Padre on Horseback. Kino's endurance in the saddle was worthy of a seasoned cowboy. This is evident from the bare facts with respect to long journeys which he made. He went to the city of Mexico in the fall of 1695, being then past the age of 50. He made the journey in 53 days, between November 16th and January 8th. The distance via Guadalajara is no less than 1,500 miles, making his average, not counting stops, nearly 30 miles per day. But that was typical of him. When he sojourned around the northern, what they call the Pimeria Alta, the land of the Upper Pima. I thought I was going to have Kino's map next, but we have Xavier del Bac. We'll get back to Kino's map. He was exploring, Jane, I'm sorry. Okay. He was exploring, following the rivers, and founding missions along the way among the native peoples. His intent was to evangelize, to convert the native peoples to Catholicism. They could then become good Spanish subjects of New Spain, because at the time that this was all going on, of course, if you looked at a map of the world, this was not Mexico, it was not the U.S., it was New Spain, La Nueva España. And their whole project was to create a version of their society here in the Americas. This is the earliest known rendition of our San Javier mission, south of Tucson. It was drawn in 1849 by a Spanish, I'm sorry, not a Spanish, by a gold rush traveler, a guy named Powell. Henry Powell was on his way to the gold fields in 1849, taking the overland route. He came through Tucson, and he sat on the hill south of the church, and he made this sketch. And here you see this Spanish Baroque mission and the beginnings of some adobe longhouses forming a square, forming a plaza in front of the church, as the Spanish would do everywhere they went. They had the laws of the Indies that they were following, which said when you set up a town, you begin by laying out a square, and you put your principal buildings on the square, and then you spread out from there. And then your city has or your town has a center. And here are the domical huts of the Native Americans, the Tohono O'odham, and their little ramadas. They built these shade structures, a little arbor in English, or a ramada in Spanish. The O'odham word is wa'ato. Wa'ato. I've learned some words of O'odham from working with the Indian. It's always, and they have it's a very beautiful, soft language. Lots of glottal stops. It's sort of like, to say hello, how are you? It's shiapa mashima. And if you're fine, you say shiapa unya. And I've learned great words like things of Gila monster and fry bread and other things like that. But the wato is basically shade. And then this would be shelter from more severe inclement weather. And they would dig down into the ground and dig a little pit, and then take the earth they had dug out and plaster it back over branches and sort of wattle and daub type construction. And that was Tohono O'odham architecture. That was it. There was the pit house and the wato. And they called the pit house the ki. Ki means house. And kiki means many houses. But you can see the beginning, kind of the roots of Spanish architecture taking root here, although the Native Americans are still living in their traditional way. A later view of San Xavier del Bac from 1864. This is by J. Ross Brown, another explorer of the Borderlands. Watercolor, you can see, this is actually during the American Civil War. Here's the Union flag flying. The Confederacy had just been driven out of southern Arizona. There was one battle of the Civil War in southern Arizona near Tucson, the battle at Picacho Peak, which was a Pyrrhic victory in a way. The Confederates held off the Unions and killed a couple of Union soldiers and then retreated. And then the Union Army from California, it was the California column, had been sent in to clear the South of rebels. But you can see there's the mortuary chapel west of the church, which is still standing. Here's some of the old domed pit houses of the Tohono O'odham. At that time, the Tohono O'odham were known as the Papago, which was a Pima Indian word that meant bean eaters. And the Spanish were traveling with the Pima, and they asked the Pima, who are these people here? And they said, oh, those people are Papago. So for hundreds of years, they were called the Papago. And then in the 1970s, during the American Indian movement, when Indian tribes were standing up and demanding respect and pride, they said, we're not the Papago, we're Tohono O'odham. In their own language, we're Tohono O'odham. And they became Tohono O'odham. Here's a little O'odham ramada, and this is the Spanish convento that was added to the church. You'll notice here that the east tower of our mission was unfinished. It was just exposed brick. And that was the case up until 1906, when the Bishop of Tucson ordered it plastered. So anyway, this is through the years. At this time, the mission was actually abandoned. There was no priest here, because after Mexican independence from Spain, the priests left. They were loyal to the Spanish crown, so they picked up and went back to Spain. And the mission stood here for 50 years in the desert without a priest. This is a rendition of San Xavier del Bac from 1887. It was drawn by Frederick Remington, who was touring the West, making engravings. It was published in Collier's magazine, San Xavier del Bac. I should explain something about the dedication of the church. San Xavier, of course, is the Jesuit saint, the Jesuit missionary to India and China. And Father Kino, our explorer priest, had adopted his name and had made San Xavier, Saint Xavier, his patron saint, his own personal patron, because as a young man, Kino suffered a very severe illness. He was in his late teens, and it was thought that he would not survive. And he prayed for the intercession of Saint Francis Xavier and said, if I'm cured, I will dedicate my life to the church and to evangelizing as you did in faraway lands among the heathens. And his life was spared. Kino entered the seminary. Actually, he studied in Austria, Kino was originally from the north of Italy. He was from Segno, near Trent, up near the Italian Alps, the Dolomite Alps. But he studied in Austria. He was a German-speaking Italian Jesuit working for the Spanish crown, which is typical of the Spanish colonial period. Many of the priests were of non-Spanish origin. There were Germans, there were Italians. I think there were even some Flemish or Belgian priests who entered the church and were sent as missionaries to the New World, to New Spain. Kino had hoped to go east, as his patron saint Xavier had done, but the church thought otherwise and sent him west. And he ended up coming through Spain to North Africa, landing at Veracruz on the coast of Mexico, into Mexico City, and then they told him where his assignment was. It was in La Pimeria Alta, the land of the Upper Pima. Okay, here's the map that I thought was going to follow my introduction of Kino. This is a map that was actually made by Kino himself. And in it he recorded the many places that he went, because as he traveled, he made notes, he made sketches. He was very well educated in mathematics and astronomy. In fact, it is thought that had he stayed in Europe, he might have become a mathematician and had a post at a university. But instead he became an explorer and a missionary. And among the many, basically he was following rivers. And he would follow the river, and he ended up over among the Yumas at the Colorado. Here, this is the Sea of California, the Sea of Cortez. This is Baja California, Parte de la California. But he published his maps as well as his writings. He wrote his own story. He wrote Favores Celestiales, Celestial Favors. That was his autobiography, in which he recounts his many trips and many adventures. Over the years that he was in northwestern Mexico, which is what we think of this as the Northwest, not the Southwest. This was the far northwest of Mexico. He stayed for 24 years, from 1687 until his death in 1711. And he was one of the longest serving missionaries. And all through these river valleys where he traveled, he would baptize, he would preach, he would evangelize, he would order the construction of churches. He wasn't a builder himself. He kept moving. He would go from town to town. Wherever there were people, he'd stop and preach and build and draw a map. But you can see some of the names, Sobaipuris, Cocomaricopas, Apaches, Sobas. These were all the native people, and he was the Yumas. He was known among the priests to have a great gift for language, and within just a few days, he could communicate with the people that he was evangelizing with. He's really an extraordinary guy. In fact, Kino is being considered now for sainthood, and he's been found venerable, which is the first step, and which is based on his works and the documentation of his life. He's now at the stage in Rome where they've assigned an historian to research further, and then if he's beatified, then he needs to have 2 miracles confirmed, and then he'll be Saint Kino. But that's in the offing. I don't know how long that's going to take, but it was the Bishop of Hermosillo, Sonora, who did the work to get him established as venerable. So here's a more modern, simplified map of the region, and this shows some of the areas that I'm going to show here subsequently. We're going to get into the Kino missions, those missions that were founded by Father Kino as part of this whole colonization effort of the Spanish. And again, as I mentioned, he followed rivers. So here's the river San Miguel, and then he'd end up on the Rio Magdalena, the Rio Altar, and that's how he worked his way up. And the places we're going to see, I think I've got 8 different Kino sites here that we'll look at. One is Cocospera, one is San Ignacio, one is Magdalena. We're going to see Pitiquito, Oquitoa, Atil, Tubutama, and Caborca, all in northern Sonora, what is now northern Sonora. The border, of course, occurs here at Nogales. Kino also founded churches at, is that Calabasas, Tumacacori. Tumacacori is now a national monument, part of the National Park Service. Tubac, San Xavier del Bac. So this is the northernmost mission that Kino founded, San Xavier del Bac, just south of Tucson. Kino also saw the Casa Grande, which is a Hohokam ruin dating to the 1300s. In fact, he's the one who named it on his map, Casa Grande, meaning great house. At that time, it was abandoned. It had been built by the Hohokam, who were the antecedents of the Tohono O'odham, and they abandoned it in the 14th century. So Kino came along, 400 years later. Pretty amazing. So Santa Cruz River. He was following the Santa Cruz River when he came to San Xavier del Bac. So with that, this again is the region. This is the natural environment that Kino traversed on horseback. Now, when he traveled, he brought with him a small contingent of soldiers. It was the cross and the sword. The soldiers were there for protection. He also brought livestock. He would drive a herd of cattle because he came to, in his view, civilize. He brought European fruits or, fruit-bearing trees. He brought pomegranates. He brought figs. He brought quince, most importantly quince, membrillo, because the Spanish soldiers would live on quince when they were in the saddle. Because from quince, the fruit of the quince, which looks like an apple, but it's very waxy, they boil it, they reduce it, and they make essentially a compote. And it's, Jane, can you explain, what do they call it in San Ignacio? What does Josefina Gallego make? It's membrillo, but it's a bar of membrillo. They make it in big copper vats, and when they cool it, it sets and it doesn't spoil. It keeps because it's super high in pectin, and they'd cut it into bars and wrap it, and then the soldiers would travel with quince on them, and that's how they would live in this hostile environment.
Like a food stick.
It was, yes, it's exactly. It's like a food stick for your hiking. It's nutritious, high in sugar for energy, but it keeps. It doesn't spoil. It's a preserve. I guess a quince preserve. So now there, as I mentioned, the reason the Spanish would found missions is there were people living in the desert at that time. These stones are from a site in northern Sonora near Caborca, but some of these same astronomical symbols were made in southern Arizona as well, at Picture Rocks and other places. This is the Greek key ornament developed by the Greeks for use on their temples, but here in the desert of Sonora, the predecessors to the Tohono O'odham were carving on rocks. They'd find stones that had a surface patina that could be rubbed away, and then this became their pictogram. So there was a culture here. There was a civilization. The Native Americans had a worldview. They had deities. They had an explanation for the world. It wasn't the Christian one, of course. And Kino brought Christianity as well as the Western way of life, because their plan was to establish outposts of the empire that would evolve into cities, much as El Paso has, or Tucson, or Hermosillo. Now here's a settlement that didn't survive, that didn't evolve. It's Cocospera, Sonora, which was a little Indian village, and Kino founded a church there before he got to Tucson, and it's now a ruin, and the village that was around it is no more. This is a modern little chapel built at the site because people still come to venerate their ancestors who are buried in the churchyard here. The adobe walls here, the mud brick walls are of the Jesuit era. On the face of it was put a burned brick facade following by the Franciscans who took over after the Jesuits were expelled. And the building has been buttressed with stone against collapse. We do have earthquakes in Arizona, Sonora. A very powerful earthquake actually in the late 1880s did some damage to our mission. So it was known that these buildings did experience earthquakes and need reinforcing. And as I mentioned, this is the graveyard, the cemetery at Cocospera, and people still go and visit their ancestors who live here, even though the town is no longer in existence. Again, the expression of Mexican culture, the veneration of the Virgin of Guadalupe, La Virgen Morena. She was essentially a Native American version of Queen, or Saint Mary, Queen of Heaven. She's the La Reina de las Americas, the Queen of the Americas. But it's an indigenous woman in these robes standing on a moon, a little crescent moon held by an angel. We'll see something like that when we get to San Xavier del Bac. This fusion of the native beliefs, and I've been told by my teacher in Mexico City, Jorge Olvera, that La Virgen de Guadalupe was based on Tonantzin, the Aztec goddess of the moon, and that it was a syncretism. It's like, here's a woman that's really special and important. You need to pay attention to her. So she became the Virgin of Guadalupe. So let's go to a town that didn't vanish with a Kino mission. This is a little town called Caburica. What's really fascinating about all these little towns in Sonora is you have the name of a Spanish saint, or European saint I should say, San Ignacio, Saint Ignatius. But it's San Ignacio de Caburica. So you have the combination of, just as in Tucson, I didn't get to the end of my story there, it's San Xavier del Bac. Bac is the Native American place name, which essentially means spring. There was a spring of water at Bac when Kino arrived, which is why there were 800 Tohono O'odham living there. It was a village. This building is older than ours in Tucson. It was completed around 1750, which is during the Jesuit era. The Jesuits were expelled from all of New Spain in 1767 by royal decree. So buildings post 1767 are Franciscan, and those prior are of Jesuit origin. And the Jesuit buildings tend to be simpler and more severe. It was an earlier time. They didn't build in such an elaborate way as we did at Tucson. I wasn't there, but those who came before us in Tucson. This building, I think, is really extraordinary as a work of architecture. All these kind of simple geometric shapes and volumes, perfect cylinders, cubes, triangles. It's really an intriguing composition. It's kind of I don't know, it's primitive, but it's sophisticated at the same time. It also has a large buttress, and you can see it has a dome on the roof. Looking at some, now these buildings are generally built of a brick. It's a low fire, kind of jumbo clay brick. Today in the Southwest we call them burned adobes, which is a contradiction since adobe means unburned brick. How can you have a burned, unburned brick? And then to protect them from the weather, they're given a coat of lime and sand, mortar, plaster, as a skin to shed water, because the brick is soft, and with wetting and drying cycles it'll break down. But there's quite a lot of architecture going on here. I mean, this could be an observatory or something. A cube, half of a sphere, a cylinder, and a cornice. You know, the building is sort of preparing to meet the sky. Architecturally, they're very interesting. And this ornament here, I've been told by Jorge Olvera, is Visigothic in origin. It's a 16-pointed star. And Jorge had seen that in northwestern Spain, in the Pyrenees, that it was used in the architecture there. And this is an elaborate rendition of the vines. Actually, I don't think it's a vine. It's a pomegranate blossom. And then there's pomegranates included here. Also on the doors. You mentioned the doors, Sue. These are pomegranate blossoms rendered in this carved mesquite door from 260 or 270 years ago. So here you're looking back out onto the plaza. I failed to mention that this church actually did become the heart of a little pueblo. It has a plaza laid out in front of it, and then a town grew up around it, which is surely what the Spanish intended at San Xavier del Bac or at Cocospera. But in the case of San Xavier del Bac, two things intervened to prevent that. One was Mexican independence from Spain in 1821, and then the Gadsden Purchase of 1854, which removed San Xavier from the Spanish influence. It's almost like the cultural umbilical cord was cut, and then that culture didn't flourish anymore. But it's quite a beautiful little building, and stare up through in that cylinder that you saw on the facade. It contains this spiral stair made of big chunks of mesquite wood, which is, you have mesquite here in Texas too, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah, because we have a native Sonoran mesquite, the velvet mesquite. It's a very hard wood. As you can see, it lasts hundreds of years. From the choir loft of the Church of San Ignacio of Caburica, you have a view down the nave, and you see it's a simple barrel vault. It's like a tunnel vault. In Spanish, it's a bóveda de cañón, a cannon vault. You'll see more elaborate forms later, but as I say, this is a simple Jesuit single nave church, all built of brick. a brick dome or brick vault, the way the Spanish built. And being an architect and having friends in Mexico, I have occasion to get on the roofs of some of these buildings. And the view, of course, is spectacular. Again, you have this cylinder of the roof, the dome over the altar. This little side piece here is the sacristy, where the priests are vested. And that's looking the other way, back over the little town. Again, as an architect, these kind of things, they really strike me. It's like, wow, that's great architecture from 1750. And then there's the official portrait, traveling in Mexico.
What was the building to the right?
Oh.
Because I know this has a dome too.
Yeah, this is a little commercial center that was built to try to echo the architecture of the church.
Okay.
And it's actually not historical at all. It was actually built within the last 15 years.
Okay.
But there is a little, there's a little town here. Looking over the town, simple houses. It's a rural town. People are farming. But this is a little orchard that Jane and I have visited. Our friend Casimiro Sanchez runs this. And he has 12 different varieties of fruit trees that he grows here. And he sells the fruit in Magdalena, up the road, 6 kilometers away. And he has quince and oranges and pomegranates and grapefruit and persimmons and other things that I can't even think of. But he grows them all based on irrigation from the Magdalena River. He's in an irrigation district, and by hand he lifts and lowers the little sluiceways that let the water in when it's his turn to get water. And it's kind of, it's this very early agriculture, but this is what the Spanish brought. When they came to this part of the world, they brought their food crops, they brought their livestock, they brought their religion, and they brought their society, their culture. So that's the Church of San Ignacio de Cabo Rica, which is one of the more complete towns and more complete churches left by Father Kino. Now, up in Magdalena, this is a bigger city. This is more of like the county seat for this part of Sonora. And this church was started under Kino, but in the 1960s, it was completely rebuilt in more of a neo-colonial style. So this is not, in fact, a colonial era church. And what had happened that provoked this reconstruction and the enlargement and formalization of this plaza was the discovery of the burial site of Father Kino. He was buried in Magdalena. No one had known previously where he was exactly. And actually, my teacher, Olvera, was on the team that located his burial site. And Kino is buried in this crypt here on the corner of the plaza. But the plaza, as you can see, is very geometrically designed. Magdalena used to have a simple little square plaza, but once Kino was found, it was a big deal, and an architect from Mexico City came and redesigned, tore down a lot of historic buildings, and built this big hexagonal plaza, which is quite beautiful in its own way. Yes, sir?
How was it confirmed that it was Kino?
A lot of work was done on that. For one thing, they brought in a forensic archaeologist, and the skeleton that they found was 6 foot 2 inches in height, as Kino was known to be. He was of European ancestry. Father Kino has no known descendants. I mean, he was a priest, so they can't check DNA on any living relatives. But they did find in examining his bones, also he had osteoporosis, which was a disease that he suffered from, in fact, that finally killed him. And they found in the lower bones of his legs, what are those called? The tibia or the fibia, this part of your leg? I can't remember. An inflection, curvature that occurs when young people, children, are growing up on mountainsides and constantly climbing up and down, their bones take on this curvature. So there were several things, as well as historical documents saying that Kino was buried between the 2nd and 3rd sillares, meaning foundation stones, of the Campos Church, which was an old adobe church that had vanished and no one knew where it was. And Jorge Olvera has written a book on this. It's called Finding Father Kino. I should have had a reference to that, about his search for Kino. And one of the things that was a key clue was interviewing the oldest people in Magdalena in the 1960s, who, as small children, had played on a little mound of earth that turned out to be the melted Campos Church. And when they finally found the burial site of Father Kino, it was right in front of City Hall. And there was a little planting strip in front of the City Hall with some fruit trees. And they dug it all up and they tore it all out. They pushed over City Hall. And so Jorge, who's an architect, felt really bad because he felt like, oh, soy el destructor del patrimonio, you know. He came in there and helped destroy historic Magdalena. But the Mexican government was very proud of Kino as an explorer who opened up the Northwest during the Spanish period. Now, Arizona was also trying to claim Kino. In fact, Arizona put a statue of Father Kino in the National Rotunda in Washington, in the Capitol building, representing our state as the first European to establish a community there. And so Mexico was trying to pull him back, you know, so Kino es nuestro, you know. So no one knew where Kino was buried. It was known that he had died in 1711, but no one was sure whether it was which side of the border it was on or where exactly he was, because the language was vague, as in many cases in that era. For instance, when it said he was buried in between el segundo y el tercer sillar of such and such a church, people were saying behind the seats. So they were saying, well, maybe he's in the floor of the church. So they're digging up the floor of the more modern church. But Jorge, with his architectural education, knew that that meant a foundation stone. It's like a bedding stone, a seating stone. So he knew where to look. And there were also other two indigenous burials, one on either side of Kino, that were made note of in the records. So to get the whole story, I recommend Finding Father Kino. It tells you the whole story, blow by blow. Jorge worked on the book for 10 years. He worked on the book longer than he worked on Finding Father Kino. But it tells all the stories. But, so that's, and now this is also in Magdalena. This is a memorial to Colosio. Oops, there's a typo. There's a B that doesn't belong there. Luis Donaldo Colosio was the candidate for the presidency of Mexico who was assassinated, that then led to the Salinas de Gortari period, which then led to the current disaster that is Mexico today. But, but had Colosio lived, I think the history of this part of the world would be very different, because he was a reform-minded guy, and he was cut down in the prime of his life. And he's sort of like the Jack Kennedy of Mexico, I think. It was a real tragic thing. Then his wife died the following year of cancer at age 37. They had two little kids. He was only 42 when he was shot. And there's a wonderful monument to them in Magdalena, which we visited, dedicated to the two of them. It's Luis Donaldo and Diana Laura. So it's LDL. They have their initials on the monument. But the plaza is successful, you know, as a plaza would be. And the festival of St. Francis, it comes alive, crazy alive with people and music. And this is actually a secondary plaza in Magdalena. They have the principal one in front of the church. Then there's a smaller commercial plaza off to the side. But that's the essence of Spanish culture, is the plaza. And they brought it to Mexico, and it becomes the essence of Mexican culture. And so many things that we think of as Mexico, we find out are Spanish. But that was the program. That was the mission program, to essentially recreate a version of Spanish culture in the New World. Part of that inheritance is the urban form of building the houses to the street, this being a plan view of a little section of a village, where your walking space, your pedestrian streets are here, your private space is within, in your courtyard, as opposed to the Anglo-American tradition of the houses in the middle of the lot with space all around it, which gives you suburbia. This gives you a very, very urban, walkable environment, and that's the inheritance of the Spanish. And they learned a lot of that, frankly, from the Arabs, who were in Spain for only 800 years. From 1711 to 1492, the entire southern part of Spain was Muslim, and they brought a lot of that culture with them. Now we're going over to the let's see, how do you say this? The furthest west, the westernmost Kino mission, dedicated to the Immaculate Conception. And I'm not sure exactly of the year he founded this church, so I didn't put it in there, but I know it was constructed between these years, because I was there in 2008 when they celebrated the bicentennial, and it took 8 years to build the church. Now this church is the most similar to our church in Tucson, and it is known that it was designed by the same architect, Ignacio Gaona, who was a Basque. He was from the Basque region of Spain. And some of those elements of Basque architecture come through, like these balconies. None of the other Kino churches have balconies like this. And the use of the twin towers and a central facade. And there's 3 openings here. That's unusual. It's actually, this is a very, very similar church to ours, although it's more diminutive. It's about a 3/4 size scale reduction. And you'll see when we get to our mission, look at the proportions, which would be the height to width and just the sensation that you get from it. These buttresses on the side are wider, and then the overall church is shorter. So it has more of a squat proportion, whereas our church is taller and more vertically proportioned. And people say, well, yeah, they're sisters. They're sisters. But they're sister churches. And here's a view of the central facade of La Purísima Concepción de Caborca. You'll see the same kind of Baroque columns. One thing you'll notice when we get to Tucson is our church is the most elaborate of all of them, the most ornate. And I'm not sure why that is, but it just is. And the interior of this church is very, very blank and very spare. It originally would have had mural paintings and statuary, much of which was lost during the revolutionary period in Mexico in the 1930s, when they basically declared the Catholic Church to be the enemy of the people, and the churches were taken over and turned into casas del pueblo, the people's houses, and they whitewashed over a lot of the imagery. And then you have the reaction to that, which was the Cristero Rebellion, as the church tries to fight back. And that was all in the 1930s. A view from the choir loft, looking down the length of the nave. It's very, very similar to the San Xavier del Bac in its form and construction, just a smaller version thereof and devoid of ornament. But from the roof of the Caborca mission, you look down in the plaza that's grown up around it. This aqueduct was it's a false aqueduct, as they say. It's more ornamental to define the space of the square. And they do have big festivals and celebrations here. And you can see kids spin their bikes around or something. But it's a plaza. That's what the plaza is supposed to be. It's the place of life where the people come. Now, this is interesting. This is a view of the Caborca mission, which you can get if you look right here, this archway. That archway was relocated from the church at Batuc. Batuc was a town that was going to be flooded by a reservoir of a dam. They were building a dam on the Rio Sonora River, and it flooded this town. So they moved the facade of the church, and they set it up so that it frames the view. And you have to wait in line to take this picture. But I got it. And there's the Cathedral of Caborca at night. It is really well regarded among the people of Caborca love their church, and they celebrate it. They even had on the 200th anniversary, they had a multimedia spectacular where they projected movies on the facade of the church, and the church itself was talking. They made it look like the church was talking. It had a really deep voice. Hace muchos años que estoy aquí. It went on and on. It was Baroque. And then they had all kinds of crazy stuff. It was great. So here's another little church founded by Kino at Pitiquito. Pitic. It's interesting. The original name of Hermosillo was Pitic, and a Pitic in the language of the indigenous is where two rivers come together. That's called Pitic, and this was two little rivers coming together, I guess, Pitiquito, or maybe a small union of rivers. And this little church was built, also of the Jesuit period, and it has the same simplicity. Now you look at this building, and if you took the crosses off the top, you might think you were looking at a mosque from Tunisia. It's the North African architecture that was brought into Spain by the Islamic invasion. Very, very similar. All based on vaults and domes. Here's a view inside the entry at Pitiquito. Take a look at this guy. This was an old mural of the colonial era that had been covered up at some point in the past. No one's exactly sure. Whitewashed over. A few decades went by. People had forgotten about the murals. And then back in the 1960s, the women of the church were scrubbing and cleaning in preparation for some big festival. And these paintings started to come out. And it turns out that there were colonial paintings. But of course, there were rumors that the church was haunted and so on. So to get up to the roof here, you take this vaulted stairway, which is, again, you can find that in North Africa. Here's a view down the nave. This is not original ornament. It was kind of redone in the neoclassical style, and I think maybe some, silver spray paint from, Home Depot or something. But one thing is these churches have been in continuous use, and they've been, every now and then, they're updated and redecorated, whereas our church in Tucson was pretty much left alone. And so you have all the original artwork. It was never restyled. I think this was on one of the tours that we did. I think that's Sheridan talking up there. Tom Sheridan, the historian.
Is the flooring original?
No, the flooring's not original. The floors of these churches would have been originally a polished lime mortar slab, kind of an early primitive concrete, because they knew how to make lime. They could burn lime, just with a wood fire. And they'd crush limestone and make lime. So but it's quite decorative, and it's in the spirit, I think. But this little baldacchino here, and I mean, the churches are very, each one is different. They're unique. Here's this guy. It's the handwriting on the wall right here. I don't read this, but I think Fontana told me, Bonnie Fontana, the historian, this is straight from the biblical passage where the guy sees the handwriting on the wall and he knows it's all over. It's like, forget about it. And on the other side is Lucifer holding a serpent. Now, much of this painting has been, as you can see, worn away and damaged. And they cleaned it and they exposed it, but it's not being repainted. This little church at Pitiquito has a little side porch that's quite beautiful architecturally. Some of these are architectural photos that don't really have to do with the Spanish missions. But okay, another church. This is also quite early. Now, oftentimes Kino's churches would be single-room adobe chapels that he would have erected. He'd bless them, he'd consecrate them, and then he'd ride on. Because he was riding from town to town. He would baptize people, he'd preach, he would show them how to butcher cattle, and he'd move on. He was basically this kind of Renaissance man, and he was making maps all the while. This little church sits high on the top of a hill above the town. It's a pretty little town of Okitoa, but the church unusually is not on the plaza. It's up on the hill with the graveyard, which is quite an elaborate graveyard. The church, as you see, also has this little expression of the Baroque with this kind of wavy line, but it's a pretty timid Baroque facade. This would have been added in the Franciscan period to the original Jesuit single nave. And the term for this type of architecture, which I learned from Jorge Lovera, is Barroco Popular, which I would translate as folk Baroque. It's like an attempt to do something elaborate like you might have seen in the big city, but you're on the edge of the frontier and you just do the best you can with what you have, which is primitive brick and lime. And this is the espadana. Instead of a bell tower, it has the bell rack, the espadana. And these niches, historically, as long as photography has been around, never contained saints. So Jorge Olvera says to me, they were Mannerist niches. They never had saints. So it's just like Michelangelo at the Laurentian Library in Florence. And then here's this elaborate scallop shell at the entryway, and you go through this door. Oh, by the way, this nylon rope rings the bells. So, and the cross lights up at night with little light bulbs. So. And there's the interior. That's very primitive, very rough. These are hewn beams, hewn mesquite beams, which means the church is not very far across because mesquite don't grow that big. The use of these corbels will actually expand the utility of your beam because the corbel is a bracket that reaches out and then the beam spans from corbel to corbel. It doesn't have to go back in the wall. So the original corbels were a structural device. They were not decorative. But then, of course, they became decorated. And in their decoration, they actually diminish in depth, which is expressive of the fact that the forces are diminishing as well. Now, the history of bracketed architecture is also very interesting. You see the same kind of corbelling in Arabia. If you went to Cairo, you'd see apartment buildings with corbelled balconies. You could trace it back through India. And ultimately, you'd find it in China. The first culture that used bracketed wood architecture was China about 5,000 years ago. And it made its way through India to the Middle East, to North Africa, to Spain, to Mexico, to here, to the north of me. So this is how ideas spread out around the world. It's the original kind of globalization. It started, hundreds of years ago. But again, it's a simple nave church. You can see some of the beams have broken and have been repaired with plates and bolts. They've essentially put a splice, like a splint, on the beam that's fractured. And this is not the original ribbing. This is cane from the nearby river that had rotted and had to be replaced. But it's the original system of using a heavy beam and a lighter lathing, which in Tucson we used mesquite beams, saguaro cactus ribs as our lathing. In New Mexico they used lighter laths made of maybe willow or whatever kind of wood you could get, but it's vigas y latillas, beams and lathing, which now everybody thinks is a certain kind of a beam and a lath, but it's actually beam and lath construction. The term for this combination of corbels, beams, and brackets is alfarje. And then you would finish it with earth on the roof. You'd put about 8 or 10 inches of earth on the roof as your roofing material. And the very, very dramatic, severe crucifix here with just blood running down Christ's body from the crown of thorns. Really, really powerful graphic imagery. And then the cemetery here is one of the more elaborate ones we visited in Sonora. The whole, veneration of the departed. Lots of funerary monuments, some of which are in rather poor state of decay. But people would erect very, very elaborate memorials to their family members who had left. Now this is interesting. A little American girl died at the age of 9. Patty Lucati. There were American engineers there working on the mines, working on the railroads, and so there was at that time in the 1930s a presence. And it is interesting, one of the themes, of course, in all of the churches is death, as we saw, which is, again, the topic of religion is the mystery of life and death, and what, is there life after death? And the Mexican tradition of the Day of the Dead, remembering and celebrating and venerating those who have gone before us, is very much a part of this architecture. This is the little town, actually. This is the town of Oquitoa, down below the hill that the church is on. The church is up on this barren hill, and it's one of the most beautiful little towns in Sonora, and they're very proud of their public gardening. They take really good care of all the streets and trees. Here's another little town. This is Atil, Sonora, on the way to Tubutama, a larger sort of precinct town. It has the plaza, it has the gazebo or the kiosk. And this is a little town, this is a little church from 1920. It's a brick church. And it replaces an earlier church from the Jesuit period that I'll show you in a minute. These bells have been here ringing for so long that the rope for the bells has worn away the brick. And it also has an espadana and a very simple bell tower. That's the ruins of the Kino Church behind the present-day church. And again, if you looked at that photograph, you might think, where am I? On the Nile somewhere? And then the symbolism of the telephone pole and the cross above the ruins of the church. So the early materials that were used were mud adobe, unfired brick, which was, again, a provisional material. They later evolved to using a burned brick, but in our part of the world, we didn't have good building stone. We just didn't. Whereas over in, for instance, in San Antonio, the Spanish built stone churches with carved stone facades that are much more elaborate. We were more of a provincial frontier type architecture. Now this is interesting. This is Tubutama, which is the most ornate church rivaling San Xavier del Bac in the Kino missions. And it's quite an interesting building. Let's see what I have to show you here. One thing is it's integrated right in town. It's right on the plaza. It's right next to the Bay Horse Bar, El Caballo Bayo. It has a super elaborate facade, but only one bell tower. And I'll tell you why that is. The tower is at the end of the church, and then the church goes away from it. This is an old aerial photograph that's on the wall of a little museum in Tubutama. So I took a photo of the photograph. And the photo, I think, must be from the 1960s, maybe. There's a car over here. But you can see, in addition to the church, you can see the town. It has its little square. It has its plaza. It has all the courtyard houses. The buildings line the streets and your private spaces inside. And it's on a hill. It's quite hilly. And so it didn't have the typical gridiron plan of the Spanish. The Spanish tended to lay out like a waffle iron of, with the plaza here and the town grew out. But in the case of Tubutama, when you're on the top of a hill and there's all these contours coming in and out, you build with what you have. Now the other thing is they faced the church away from the hill. They faced it towards the plaza. So this could become part of the fortification or the defense of the town if the Apaches were coming up the hill, which is one reason it was built that way. It's part fortress, part church. It has a single dome above the crossing. There's a cross-shaped plan. So here's the context, the immediate context of the church is this classic Sonoran row housing, we'd call it. There's a classic Sonoran Chevy. And here's the church. And what's really amazing is that it's got so much, infrastructure. It's got all the wires, the overhead. But what ends up happening is the shadows of these electric wires become part of the composition of the church. Like here you have this little cornice and there's the shadow of these wires. So in the end, if you look at it, you say, oh, it's too bad there's all those wires. But then you realize it becomes part of the architecture in the shade. But it's a most unusual church because you enter through the side of the nave, not the end of the nave. Then you turn and go down the length of the church. And I've never seen a church done like this anywhere. It's really unusual and really quite stunning. On the facade also, there's a sundial here and all these shells. The use of the scallop shell is a Franciscan reference, St. Francis of Assisi, because these buildings, most of the buildings we're seeing here were either built by the Franciscans or they had a facade added to a Jesuit church by the Franciscans. And to venerate St. Francis, they would use the shell symbol, because St. Francis in his lifetime made the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, and they used the scallop shell both to beg alms with, to drink from streams with. They'd use it as a dipper, and to this day, it's the symbol of that pilgrimage. And people who go on that pilgrimage now buy little, golden scallop shells to use as a pin. But it's part of that tradition. So where you see the scallop shell used in the architecture, you know it's a Franciscan church. And it's used here at the entrance. There's another view from the plaza. Here's a little bandstand, a little kiosk. So the way this church works is this is the sacristy where the priests are vested. Then they enter. That's the high altar. There's the crossing. There's the nave. And then there's the bell tower. It's a great design. I hope to use it one day if I find the right client. Here's the tower, draped with lights and the shadows of the wires. This is the brick. This is the brick that was used, that was left exposed. Let's see, a view of the facade. Here's the sundial I mentioned, the scallop shells. These are actually, on either side of here, are relief sculptures of angels. And when I first saw this building, I thought they were holding, I thought they had tail feathers, because it looks like they have tail feathers. But Jorge Olvera pointed out to me that the angels are holding chickens, and that's a symbol of St. Peter, because this church is dedicated to St. Peter, San Pedro y San Pablo de Tubutama. Let's see if I have a title here. Let's go back. There we go. Saints Peter and Paul of Tubutama, Sonora. And Peter was the one who betrayed Christ 3 times before the cock crew. So these angels holding chickens, or I guess they're roosters, not chickens. Chickens don't crow, roosters crow. Okay. Angels holding poultry. But they're not angels with tail feathers. But again, you have this kind of Visigothic ornament, these spiky triangles, empty shells. It's this ultra folk Baroque. It's not sophisticated. It's kind of primitive, but very exuberant. It's full of this vitality of expressing this delight in religion, which is a big. Now, the minute you walk in that elaborate facade, you're confronted with this. It's the OG arch, which is the Moorish arch, and these crazy columns that look like pumpkins or something. But this is a folkloric interpretation of the Baroque.
Are those for architectural accent or part of the foundation to support the building?
They're purely ornamental. Yeah, you could take down these pillars and the building would stand. What they were trying to do was embellish the structure. Some of those earlier Jesuit structures were just simple boxes, and here they're trying to put some architecture in it. some engaged columns with this Baroque shape that they're going in and out, and you have all these different kinds of moldings. It's the Baroque. They're going for Baroque. They're trying to express all this vitality and movement. And so then you turn. Oh, this is one of the side chapels dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And there is this custom in Mexico and the Borderlands of dressing the statues in actual clothing. Now, when we get to San Xavier del Bac, you'll see what this originally would have looked like. This would have been multicolored. It would have been, every little square inch would have been painted. But at a certain time in the past, it was all whitewashed over. And it is possible that with time and money, this could be recovered. It could be painstakingly restored. But I think the lack there is money. But again, you have this engaged column. These are non-structural columns. They're simply there to ornament. It's like a retablo, behind the altar, but it's done in plaster and brick instead of wood, because there wasn't adequate wood around to carve in this kind of shape. So they built it up out of sculpted plaster on brick. Lots of ornaments, lots of flowers and things, flowering plants symbolizing, I think, Mary the rose without a thorn. So everything is ornamental. Now looking up into the nave, there's an octagonal drum leading to a dome. And here's some of the original ornament that survived. Look at this cornice line. The cornice line is plaster, but it has been marbleized with some red and green sort of amoeba-looking like things. But again, it was an attempt to make it look more elaborate, like something you might see in Mexico City, a marble cornice. Super elaborate carved ceiling in the choir loft and over the nave. Unfortunately, this has been repaired with Portland cement, which is an incompatible material for these old soft brick and lime buildings. And so unfortunately, that's going to actually do more harm than good over the coming years. And hopefully someone will come along and fall in love with this building. Maybe Carlos Slim will reach for a penny out of his pocket and pay to fix this. But it should be fixed, because it's really an important little building. Again, the Day of the Dead, the strength of religion and the awareness of death in life, that's part of the Catholic culture, the Spanish culture. This particular altar of the dead is dedicated to Colosio and his wife, to Luis Donaldo and Diana Laura, and this is actually from Magdalena, Sonora. Okay, so let's have a little recap of where we've been. We have been out to Caborca. We have been to Magdalena. We've been out to Cocospera. The little towns don't show on this map. This is more of a tourist map telling you how far it is from Alamos to Hermosillo. But the one American town that's shown on this map is Tucson. This is off the website of the tourism for Sonora. And what's funny is they have this in English from Hermosillo too, but they have Estados Unidos de America. They give the Spanish abbreviation. It's great. But I like it that we're on the map in Tucson. We've been here, we've been here, we've been here, and now we're going to go north. Here's our mission of San Xavier del Bac as it appeared in the 1870s. And this is one of the original earliest known photos from a series of photos from 1871. And at that time, the building was just about 80 years old. It was but it had been abandoned for 50 years. And you can see what happens with the cycles of the seasons, hot and cold, wet and dry. Building materials break down. The wood rots. The balustrade crumbles and falls. Who knows, maybe taking this out. The columns here have eroded and fallen. These columns, these decorative columns, were built of brick around a pole, a wooden pole, about a 2-inch diameter pole of wood, and then brick was placed around it and plaster, sort of like early reinforcing bars for a vertical column. But there were originally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 columns. Here 2 have fallen.
And the lady with the drum has her head.
Let's see. Where are we? Right here? Oh, right here. Oh, yes.
On the top.
Oh, right here. She's. Yes, the saint here. I think that is Saint.
Head.
Yes. These statues have weathered quite a bit since then. I'm trying to remember which saint that is. It's either Cecilia or Lucy. And she's carrying not a drum, but a tray, which is,
What that is.
yes,
Okay.
which is part of the story of her martyrdom. But we don't want to go into that here. All four saints on the facade here are female. This is St. Catherine of Alexandria, St. Barbara, either Lucy or Cecilia, and either Cecilia or Lucy. And here is a view from the 1880s. I don't know if this is a wedding party that's come out. She looks rather bride-like with a veil and a white dress. But again, the building was not attended to by a priest, so any visitor could climb up inside of it and go on the roof. And we know from the Arizona Historical Society, from people's letters and journals, that it was a popular Tucson activity at that time period to take a picnic, take your horse and buggy down to the mission, consume your picnic, and ride back to town. It was an all-day affair. It was, go visit the mission was a day-long affair. And now on Interstate 19, you can be to the mission in 15 minutes. So it's kind of, we lose a lot of that sense of time and passage. But we're following. The building has not yet been given its first restoration. Oh, look at this. This balustrade is completely gone here now. If we back up. Because, although we are a desert, we do get rain in Tucson. We get about 12 inches of rain a year, half of it in the summer and half in the winter. We have very dry fall periods and very dry springs. But in the summer, we get tremendous chubascos, big wind-driven. We'll have, in half an hour, we'll have an inch of rain. And water, of course, will break things down. Here you see the east tower unplastered. And then right here at the top of this lantern on the dome, the cross is leaning back. And I'm wondering if maybe it was hit by lightning or something that pushed it back. All right, the mission during its first restoration, which went from 1906 to 1910, it was funded by the Bishop of Tucson, Henry Grandjean, who poured his family fortune into fixing the church because he wasn't going to have any heirs to leave it to. He was a wealthy guy from France, from Lyon in France, who had joined the priesthood and became the Bishop of Tucson and funded the repair of the balconies, the plastering, replastering. He finally had this tower plastered, and they were using lime and sand plaster. Now you'll notice here that this wall has fallen down, and there used to be a wall in front of the church, as you see here. That fell in the earthquake of 1887, which was a powerful earthquake. And notice also how many columns are left on the facade. 1, 2. All the others fell in that earthquake because the earthquake just shook the building so much that any kind of vulnerable element that was just hanging on just came right off. But at this time, the building was given its coat of lime plaster. And prior to that time, we don't really know what color the mission was. There was no color photography. And now it's brilliant white except for the facade, and it's become known as the white dove of the desert. But I do get asked periodically, what color was the mission in the 1800s? Was it white or was it tan or what was it? We don't really know. So here you see the west tower, which has been fully restored, the east tower, which is awaiting restoration, and the central facade and the dome and the balustrade, and all these elements we've been looking at over the course of this lecture. This view is from 100 years ago. This is from 1913, taken on the hill of the cross, east of the church, looking over the little, what would have been a plaza, had Spain stayed in control. You would have had a plaza here, building the Palacio de Gobierno, some houses of the mayor. But here, what we have is the mission just standing in this desolate terrain of the desert. And here's a photo from last year showing the same view. There's a road that comes in here now. This is sort of organized gravel parking. This is a pedestrian area where the Native Americans do use it for festivals and processions, and they set up booths and they have dances and set off rockets and things to celebrate the saints' days. We've moved the road around. The road actually used to come right here and there, cutting right in front of the mission, but we got that pushed back. And there's the church that's grown up with a convent and a friary for the brothers, and a view of our mission. This is a little seating area for visitors that's in the shape of a Tohono O'odham pit house, sort of sunken in the ground to give shade. Think back to the Caborca church and think about the slenderness and the height of this one. Again, we're about 25% taller. So Our tower is 80 feet high, and theirs is 60. Same architect, Gaona. But some interesting features I'll point out here of the building. One is these red lines that you see are rain sluices. So the water that pours over the building drains off down these sluices, and they're tinted with a red iron oxide. That's not paint, it's actually oxide. And that's another expression of that Islamic tradition in Spanish architecture, which is called the mudéjar, which I put here. Mudéjar meaning it's the root of Islam that stayed culturally. When the Catholic kings had the reconquest of Spain, they pushed out the Moors. They called them Moors. They weren't Moors, they were Spanish. They'd been there for 8 centuries. But if someone chose to stay behind and convert to Catholicism, that didn't mean they left behind their cultural traditions and how they built. So when it came time to build a building and get the rain off the roof, they built this bajada de agua, much like the Arabs would have. In fact, you can see the same rain drain on the mosque, the great mosque at Sana'a in Yemen. And then if you look at the balustrade, if you look at the arches on the balustrade, it's a horseshoe arch, which you might see in Granada or other Islamic cities in Spain. The concentration of all the ornament at the entryway, the rest of the church is left blank. That's done in a mosque. You concentrate all the tile work here. So many overlapping cultural traditions. Again, the corbel bracket was brought by the Arabs to Spain, who brought it here. This is the Baroque, that's sort of the curving line. When we were working on this part of the building, our crew, our masons called this Dairy Queen, which was for obvious reasons. All this floral ornamentation. This looks very much like a pomegranate blossom. Pomegranate in Spanish, Granada. The name of the Islamic capital of Spain, Granada. And a Granada is an expression in Islam. It's a symbol of creation because it's so full of seeds. So much of that overlapping culture. Super ornamented facade, as we saw at Tubutama in Sonora. This is the coat of arms of the Franciscans who had the building built. It's the third order. It has the knot of the Franciscans. I think I have a better shot of it here. Oh, here's the lions. The ruling house of Spain was León y Castile, so they have a lion here. Oh, let's see. Here's a view of the mission from the east. There's the finished tower, the unfinished tower. We're now working on the arcade of the sacristy. In the recession, our fundraising stalled and we weren't able to tackle the east tower, so we're hoping to get onto it next year. A view of the dome from the west tower, showing the whole building as a series of vaults and domes. Something you might see in North Africa. The restoration's underway. This is Freddy Garcia, one of our Tohono O'odham workers. We employ 4 O'odham. Our crew is led by Danny Morales, who's a Mexican-American guy. His ancestry is very interesting. Mexican, his father's Mexican. His mother is Mexican but has an Irish grandfather and a Yaqui grandmother. So Danny has blue eyes, but if you look at his profile, he has the profile of a Yaqui Indian. So he's an American, right? But Danny runs the crew. He's got O'odham guys working for him, Freddie and Basil, repointing. We've taken off cement. The building in the 1950s was heavily cemented because it was thought at the time that's the best possible thing. But we found over time that it's actually eating up the softer brick inside. So we're getting the cement off, repairing, repointing. There's Basil. In the plaster, we're adding this folkloric ingredient, which is the nopal cactus pads, which is a tradition that the Spanish have used for centuries. And it was recommended to us on the restoration team by Jorge Olvera, an architect from Mexico City. They use it widely in Mexico. La baba de nopal, they squeeze this glue out. And it's actually, it's a fluidifier for the mortar. It's a, what do you call it? It retards the drying time. There's a word for that. But it makes the plaster dry more slowly, which helps it cure better. Because the lime mortar and plaster has to cure by combining with carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And if it dries too quickly, it doesn't carbonate totally, and it can fail and fall off. And I've visited lime sites where the lime mortar has not worked. But we've had really good success with lime. Freddie putting it on the wall. There's our, there's our old soft brick. Fairly rough, primitive brick. There's a restored, primed with lime, ready for plaster. Coarser sand, finer sand, finish coat. Going back to the original. And there it is under renovation. couple years ago, and the Morales boys this was Danny's son, DJ, putting a coat of lime on the roof. You can see we're south of town, about 10 miles from downtown Tucson, which means that we don't have a Walmart next door, which is kind of great. The mission is off on the Native American reservation, standing in the desert as it has all these years. So let's go inside. I thought we were going to go inside a minute ago, but I didn't remember the order I finally ended up with. A view of the central facade. Again, the 4 niches have 4 female saints. Before I start the next sentence, I'll see what the next slide is. My drawing of the facade. This drawing of the facade was created as a locator diagram for Dr. Fontana's book on the art of the mission, A Gift of Angels, so that you could look at each element and know what you're looking at. And indeed, 11 is St. Catherine of Alexandria, 9, St. Barbara, 10 is St. Cecilia, St. Cecilia, and 12 is St. Lucy of Syracuse. The ornate doors, which had at one time a copper sheeting nailed onto them. Here's that balcony. There's the Franciscan scallop shell. There's the coat of arms of the Franciscans. This was a statue of St. Francis Xavier, the patron saint of the church. What's interesting about this church, among many other things, is it is a Franciscan church dedicated to a Jesuit saint. The Franciscans, followers of St. Francis of Assisi, kept the dedication to St. Francis Xavier that had been given by Kino. And so this is another unique thing about our church. Only women saints in the facade, and it's a Jesuit saint over a Franciscan church. Here are the volutes of the facade, these curlicues here on each side. On this side we have a mouse, and on this side we have a cat looking across. These are the lions of Spain. The coat of arms of Mary and the coat of arms of the Jesuits are all on this facade. So that would be St. Lucy of Syracuse holding this little bowl. And actually, I've climbed up on here. There actually are 2 little glass eyes in there. This would be St. Barbara in the upper left register. Now, these columns that you see here are replicas that were done in the 50s. They were castings. There were 2 surviving columns of the original 10. And I've read the account of the architect who did the restoration in the 50s. They wrapped the 2 columns with blankets. They tied them with baling wire. They built a wooden crate around them, pulled them off, put them on a train, a Southern Pacific train, out to LA to a studio that made movie sets. They made a mold and cast 10 columns from 2. So some of what you're seeing here is a replica. However, all of this ornament is original, and the statuary is original. Here's the lions, and there's the mouse on the curlicue. There's that Franciscan coat of arms. They call it the 3rd order, Tercer Orden. The bare arm is that of Christ. The robed arm is that of St. Francis. They're both nailed to a cross, and that symbolizes the fact that St. Francis of Assisi experienced the stigmata, or the wounds of Christ, during his lifetime. And then this rope, this pretzel-like knot, is the knot that the Franciscans tie in their rope belt, which is part of their habit. So all of this is symbolic. Here we're toiling in the vineyards. These are the vineyards. There's grapevines. Actually, the grapes are just off the picture here. That's Maria Regina, Mary the Queen of Heaven, and IHS is the abbreviation for Jesus in Greek, which is the symbol of the Jesuits. That is what's left of St. Francis Xavier. You can see his robes. He was cemented. That's they sent a couple guys with a bucket of cement up back in the 60s to cement him. But hopefully, when we get to this part of the work, we will fix that. There's that shell again. The original colors. This is iron oxide, which is why it hasn't faded. It's rinsed off, but it has not faded. There's our facade. Very similar. I had a similar shot of Caborca, if you might remember. But remember, Caborca's facade has all been overpainted. It's all monochrome. But historically, it would have been polychrome. So let's go inside, finally, after I promised you that. The doors of the mission, which are actually of pine, not mesquite. Some mountains south of town, about 40 miles south of town, are the Santa Rita Mountains, where a Tumacacri mission is. And so the pine for the doors was brought 40 miles to the mission. All the mesquite that they used elsewhere could have been obtained right from the site. This is the door. You hold this handle to enter the church. It's the sacred and the profane. It's the serpent in the garden. You're leaving the outside world. You're coming inside. Here's a plan of the church. It has a Latin cross plan, a crossing here, the high altar or sanctuary. The sacristy is here, so the priests would become vested here and then enter the sanctuary. Above the entry on the south is the choir loft, and these are the two towers, the west and the east. And in the first level of the west tower is the baptistry, and then the stairway goes up inside the wall. Here's our view. So thinking back to Caborca, which is basically plain, devoid of ornament, it's ultra ornamented with a painted wainscoting. Had this church been built in southern Spain, in Sevilla, this would have been ceramic tile. But here on the frontier of the Spanish world, at the rim of Christendom, it was done with paint. And this geometric ornamentation is clearly Islamic in derivation. And if you think of the art of Islam, there was a prohibition on representing living things, people or the deity could not be represented. So they developed this geometric art. And this is a Baroque device. This is the door to the cemetery. You go through this door to the west, you're coming to the cemetery. For symmetry, they painted a door here. And they did the same thing at the high altar. The door to the sacristy is here. Opposite it, there's a door painted on the wall. So it's the Baroque. They're fooling the eye. Under the choir loft is this little angel, kind of sculpted, kind of a mysterious little angel. The lantern or the lamp hanging under the choir loft, which is pure silver. This is made of silver. And this is a pomegranate here. This is the base of the west tower, which is 6 feet in thickness. The wall is 6 feet in thickness. The reason for that is it contains the stair up to the roof. The stair is a tunnel in the wall. The original baptismal font, which is a Jesuit piece that's 300 years old. This is 100 years older than the church. The lid is hammered copper. This is tufa stone ornamented with green and red paint. And for all the world, this looks to me like a turtle on his back. Whether there's his breastplate and shell. Anyway, I don't know if that was symbolism or not, or just a coincidence. Here's an unfinished dado pattern. They never finished the painting on the interior. The church was left incomplete, and there are many theories about why that was, but Fontana established it was simply that they ran out of money. Here is a view, also from Fontana's book, of the nave and the crossing, the high altar here. And what you find is this is the retablo mayor, the altarpiece, which is an echoing of the facade, which is here. The choir loft being above the sotocoro. Oh, let's see, that's the door to the baptistry. Those are the doors out west to the cemetery. And here we're looking into the west transept. This painting here is of the Last Supper. And the 4 paintings in the high altar all have to do with the Christmas story. A view into the ceiling of the nave, which is plaster, lime plaster on brick. Recall the ceiling at Tubutama, which was the other elaborate church in Sonora. These angels are pulling on these ropes to open up the curtains of heaven, because the dome of the church would symbolize the heavens. There's the scallop shell of Francis, but it might also be seen as the scallop shell of the polylobed arches of the Islamic period. You could go to Toledo, to the Alcázar, and see a sculpted arch just like that. Here's the cornice, marbleized as at Tubutama. A Franciscan saint, we know he's a Franciscan, he's wearing the Franciscan habit. I have to admit, I don't remember the name of this saint, but here's the monstrance, which is holding the host. So this is what holds the bread, the symbol of the body of Christ, is held in this monstrance, which shows the holy wafer. A view from the choir loft down the length of the nave. I've shown you other slides of a similar view of the other churches. We saw San Ignacio, which had a simple barrel vault. We had Pitiquito. We had Caborca, which is basically whitewashed. These are the mural paintings on the wall. The statues are in niches. The high altar is this kind of vision of heaven. original statuary. Now, the statuary at Xavier del Bac was brought up from central Mexico. The statues are way too sophisticated to have been made on the frontier, but they were brought by pack train up the 1,500 miles or so from central Mexico. Here again is the Islamic arch. And then this pattern looks like thumbprints dipped in blue paint simply to fill in the empty space. As you know, the Baroque abhors a vacuum, so they would just fill in all the blank areas with a stippling effect, which is quite, look at this, it's quite abstract in a way. And I don't know whether it's rainfall or raindrops or what it is exactly, but it's something throughout. The basic color scheme is based on red, blue, and yellow on the primary colors, although they also got a green, obviously by mixing their blue and yellow. But the pigments are fairly simple, and they're iron oxides. The blue is a Prussian blue involving, what's the, is it cuprite? Fontana would know it. The Prussian blue was brought up from the south. It was not made on site. Here's a couple of lions guarding the altar rail, looking back towards the choir loft.
Couldn't the stippling, because from a distance, could that have been meant to imitate mosaic?
It may possibly have been. That could have been a mosaic effect, but just done with what was available at the time. These lions, angels, these are the lions. The lions are made of carved cottonwood. These two lions are not the original. These are replicas. The originals were stolen in the mid-1980s by a homeless guy who was staying at the mission. The brothers used to let people just come and stay, and the church was always open. They never locked the church. And in 1985, this homeless guy who also clearly had mental illness stole the lions, disappeared, and the lions were never recovered. It was thought that he burned them and threw them into a pit because there was some old wood found in a pit behind the mission. So Gloria Giffords, who's an art restorer, and the mother of our Congresswoman, Gabby Giffords, had these lions recarved in Mexico, in Puebla, at a workshop of carousel animals. A family makes carousel animals, and then she refinished them personally. Jinx Giffords. And this is gilded. She used gold leaf and blew it on and burnished it. So I'm thinking that Father Kino needs 2 miracles to become a saint. I would say one of his miracles is the fact that our Congresswoman was shot through the head and lived. Gabby Giffords miraculously lived through the shooting. So I think Kino's got one miracle. That was in his district. That was in his territory. The angels are carved of wood. Their clothing is actual cloth dipped in paint and then formed to these folds and shapes. And the dome above the crossing is also super elaborate, filled with mural paintings, and each one of these little medallions is a significant figure of the church. The 4 bishops, there are 4 bishops shown on the squinches of the arch, are the doctors of the church, the original philosophers, St. Augustine and St. Jerome, and 2 others I can't think of right now, but it's in Fontana's book if you want to know all the art history. The best explanation I've received of the Retablo Mayor is that it's a vision of heaven. So the priests are preaching to the Native Americans. They're saying, if you join the Christian church, you live a Christian life, at the end of your life, you go to heaven. And what is heaven like? It's a beautiful city with golden columns, and God the Father is there, and all the saints. St. Mary is there. That's St. Francis Xavier. And it's also at the end of the church. So you enter the church, you go through the nave, and at the end of the nave you have the high altar. This is my diagram of the high altar, explaining who all the saints are. On the 2 sides of Mary, you have St. Peter and St. Paul. This is St. Simon the Zealot, and St. Andrew, I believe, is 9. Yes, St. Andrew, San Andres. What's interesting, in Fontana's book, he opted to use the English version of all the saints' names. He didn't say San Andres. He didn't say San Pedro y San Pablo. He said St. Peter and St. Paul. And the reason he did that, Fontana's a really strict disciplinarian as far as his intellectual work, because the book is written in English. It's written for an English-speaking lectorate or audience. I'm going to use English. So, okay, there you go. So even though, if you look at the base of the statue, it's written on the wooden base, San Andres. It's St. Andrew in the book. These columns that you see, these are the Baroque engaged columns that as they come down, they get thinner, which is the opposite of what gravity is doing. As the weight accumulates, you would want your column to be thickest at the base where it's carrying the most weight, but they narrow it down. That's a Baroque device to make the whole thing feel ethereal, as if it's floating. Interestingly enough, the most prominent figure is St. Mary. And she's shown here. Okay, there's God the Father, rendered, raising his hand in blessing. God the Father must be an Irishman. He has a red beard. And then here's the beginning of this scallop shell. This ornament you'll see later. This is actually a silver leafing. That's why it's so iridescent. He's got his hand on this orb, the orb of power. And then here's, this is Mary. This is Mary as the Immaculate Conception, La Purísima Concepción. These roses have no thorns. And there she is. She's on a crescent moon being carried by angels, much as the Virgin of Guadalupe is represented. All this plaster work, this is a drapery, but it's done in plaster and molded. Anything that you see that shines like gold is actually gilded. They've used gold leafing on burnished plaster. Very interesting. There's the patron saint of the church, St. Francis Xavier, the Jesuit. Little angels everywhere. Angels pulling ropes to reveal the saint within the niche. There's St. Peter. He's got the keys in his right hand, the keys to the kingdom. Ultra Baroque, ultra Baroque. That's the other style that's used for this. Here's this inverted pyramid at the base of the column, estipite. Don Jorge has taught me Barroco estipite. And estipite is this inverted pyramid. That's this visual device to basically fool the eye and give you this floating sensation. Each little medallion here has a religious symbol. There's the ladder, Jacob's ladder, I would imagine. Each column has a different symbol. There's an olive, there's a cedar, the cedars of Lebanon. Oh, I should mention this kind of purplish iridescent feature, that's also silver leafing, as is this. And then you have the red and the gold and this. I mean, the ornamentation is just over the top. I mean, it's just ultra Baroque exuberance. The other word for this is churrigueresco. Churrigueresco. There were 3 brothers in Spain, los hermanos Churriguera, had developed this super ornate Baroque style, and it has been characterized as churrigueresque, as well as, I like, my favorite is folk Baroque, I think, is more telling of the era. But look at the wing of the angel. It's a wooden wing, painted in gold and red and blue, and then here's some of that iridescent silver leafing. Now, the philosophy of the interior restoration is if some of the original paint has flaked off, it's not going to be put back. But the surviving original paint is cleaned and stabilized. And that way, everything that your eye sees when you visit Mission San Javier is original 18th century artwork. This color scheme in the side chapel is a red panel and a green panel. A red panel and a green panel. This entire chapel is really dedicated to the Virgin Mary. There she is in this niche. There she is at the base of the cross. This is a painting of the Virgin of the Rosary. This is a painting of the Education of the Virgin. There's something like 40 representations of the Virgin Mary in this church, far more than the Saint Francis. I mean, like 10 times more than Francis. And Fontana has observed that this really should have been St. Mary. This church should have been dedicated to St. Mary. Obviously, the Franciscans who had this church built were very devoted to Mary. There she is, Mary of the 7 Sorrows. She has 7 daggers in her heart. And look at this. It's the lamp that was done in silver over the entryway. Oh, Jorge Olvera is my teacher. He's gone now. He died 10 years ago, actually, at the age of 87. But he told me the story of how the Franciscans succeeded the Jesuits. This was done by order of Charles III, I believe, who was a despot, Charles III, who had absolute power. And he decided it was not convenient to have the Jesuits setting up little communes all over, because they would go and organize society and get people working in farms, and everybody was sharing everything. And the leadership of Spain was saying, what we really want is a bunch of workers for our mines. So they wanted slaves, not souls. So there's always that tension. You've seen the movie with De Niro in it, The Mission? Yeah, it's about, it's about the Jesuits in Paraguay. But the Jesuits all over were expelled. And Jorge Olvera explained to me the way that was done. That on the same day, around the world, in all the Spanish Empire, the Jesuits were out of there. What they did was they sent out a decree with a royal seal, not to be broken upon pain of death, on a parchment. And they gave 4 months for it to reach the ends of the earth. So after 4 months, on the same day around the world, whether it was Paraguay or here or the Philippines, The same letter was opened up, the Jesuits are out of here as of now. So I'm thinking that was instant messaging in the era of Charles III. You just had to have enough advance time to get the word out. And then the Franciscans were sent in to take over all the Jesuit missions. Another statue to St. Mary in the East Chapel. And super ornamentation and ironwork. This was in the sacristy, and angels and stippling. And the thing I like about this little angel is he's a Native American angel. He's got dark hair and eyes and copper skin. That, of course, is only the Sistine Chapel. That is only our San Xavier del Bac. That's only the Taj Mahal. And this is our Taj Mahal in Tucson, Arizona. Thank you very much. And I would be glad to take questions.
Ask questions.
The two churches that were designed by the Basque architect with balconies, were the balconies functional or intended to be functional, or were they purely ornamental?
I think the central balcony was functional because the priests could go out there and stand on the balcony and say Mass outdoors, which was done often in Mexico. And in fact, there is sort of an atrium in front of San Xavier del Bac, which would serve for that purpose. Yes, ma'am.
Were the arches made with a mold of wood insert, or were they stacked and then?
We believe the arches were built with wood centering. There were no records taken at the time. You know, there's been no floor plan found, or the Franciscans kept fairly poor records. But they would have had to have built some kind of a wood centering. But they could have built, a mesquite kind of half of a wheel, and then just moved it, because all the arches are similar. So they'd build one, and they'd use it here and here and here and here and here. And we know it took them 14 years to build the church. And it's 80 feet high, and it's 107 feet long by 67 feet wide. I mean, even today, to build that church would be a massive undertaking. And it was done in the late 1700s with no, power tools, obviously, a lot of Native American labor. I mean, a lot of guys worked really hard to harvest all the mesquite, to burn the bricks, to burn the lime, to raise the walls. And then the decorations were done probably by a traveling band of itinerant artists who traveled the Spanish frontier decorating churches, because there's a lot of similarities between Tuputama and San Javier. The sad thing is that the ornament was lost from the other Kino missions during the period of abandonment. So, all right. All right, well, thank you for your attention. Thanks for coming out on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Okay, you're welcome.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from Humanities Texas, the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities.